And we're joined by David Baria, former Mississippi legislator and a former candidate for Senate, U.S. Senate from the state of Mississippi. David, how are you today? Thank you for joining us.
Man, I'm doing great. How are you, Ashley? Thank you for having me, by the way.
Oh, I'm very happy to have you, David. You and I have known each other for a number of years, got to know each other a little bit after Hurricane Katrina, and worked on a number of issues and initiatives over the years. So it's great to have you here to have your perspective. We talked a lot earlier in the show about the debate last night in the governor's race. You're supporting Brandon Presley and here to sort of serve as a surrogate for his campaign. Tell me some of your thoughts about the debate last night from watching.
Well, first and foremost, I think that Brandon clearly won the debate because of his message on expanding Medicaid and tackling corruption and cutting the grocery tax. But I guess in terms of the larger themes, I felt like, and I'm trying to be as objective as possible here, but I felt like Brandon's presence was much more commanding, and his leadership capabilities, I think, came through when he talked about his guts and backbone. I mean, it just, to me, made Tate seem mousy and doctrinaire. And I know I've had the pleasure to meet both of those people. Brandon's an old friend of mine. I've known Tate for several years, and it just seemed very clear to me that Brandon did the better job in that debate last night.
You know, David, you're an old political pro, a pro of many campaigns. You've run a statewide race, and so you've sat in that seat knowing what it's like. It just occurs to me that turnout is really going to be the deciding factor here. Who can turn out their voters? And that's gotten more and more difficult as Mississippi has become a redder state. But we also know, based on the demographics of the state, if black voters turn out in big numbers, if voters from Northeast Mississippi and the Delta come out for Brandon Presley, this is likely going to be a very close race. It certainly seems that way now. In your mind, what's the closing message for the Presley campaign in getting their voters to the polls to actually vote?
Well, first of all, let me say it's surprising to me as a longtime political observer that does come down to turnout, and that's because Brandon Presley and his campaign has done such an excellent job of fundraising so that they could keep pace with the Tate Reeves money machine. But turnout is going to be critical, and I know that it is all hands on deck. That they have a plan. The campaign has a plan to get the votes, get the souls to the polls, if you will, on election day. And his closing message, I think, has to continue to be that that expansion of Medicaid is a rising tide that lifts all boats in our state in terms of providing health care to citizens who don't have it. And this group of people that we're talking about, remember, 230,000 uninsured working people in Mississippi are disproportionately people of color. And I think he has to keep pressing the issue that Tate has been pay for play the entire time he's been in politics. And you have to look no farther than the I-55 corridor and look to the west and look to the east and see that where Tate has put all of his the economic development money that he crows about, it's all on the east side of I-55. There are very few, if any, projects that go on the west side of I-55, which of course is where the Delta is, where the Mississippi River counties are. And Brandon has to keep reminding people that that's the way Tate has governed and will continue to govern.
You know, I think about 4 years ago when Jim Hood ran against Governor Reeves, and I think political observers in Mississippi believed then that it was going to be a very close race. It was close, but certainly not that close in the grand scheme of things. Tate had a pretty commanding victory over Jim Hood. Jim Hood being a figure that had been well known in Mississippi politics for quite some time, reelected a number of times as Attorney General, great name recognition across the state. Brandon Presley last night may have been the first time that a lot of folks in Mississippi got to see him on a stage like that, and very polished, great retail politician. But do you worry that if Jim Hood couldn't make it across that finish line, we're going to see a repeat of 4 years ago?
Well, of course, that's a concern. But Brandon Presley is a different person. He's a different campaigner. And I think, in no disrespect to my friend Jim Hood, I think Brandon has done a better job. First of all, he has taken absolutely nothing for granted. He's visited all 82 counties. He is probably the best retail politician that I have seen in my lifetime in the state of Mississippi. He's raised a considerable amount of money, as I've already alluded to. And the thing about Brandon Presley that I really like is his ability to punch back. And he can do so without being really offensive. He's relatable, and he doesn't take anything lying down. He's going to come back at you, and he's going to call you out when you're misrepresenting things, which is what Tate has done and did last night again in the debate. And Brandon just won't take it. He's going to tell him, that's not true, and this is why. So, and one other comment on that, Ashley, the race that Hood ran was a good one. And the percentage may not have looked as close as we might have wanted as Democrats, but the raw vote, was only about 47,000 votes separating Tate Reeves and Jim Hood. And that is something that if we can have the type of turnout that we have in presidential election years, or maybe even the type of turnout we had for Mike Espy in 2018 in the runoff, or in 2 years later when he ran, then this is a hill that we can surmount.
One of the things that I think has been really clear from the Presley campaign since the beginning, and I think it's smart, pragmatically, I think it's very smart, is they're trying to reach out to those sort of center-right Republican voters who might cross over, who might be willing to cross over and vote. Equally, I think as smart has been the way that the Reeves campaign has painted the fundraising that Brandon Presley has done, the money that's come in from out of state. In some ways, the first test of this campaign was, can Brandon Presley keep up with Tate Reeves from a fundraising standpoint? And he's done that. In fact, he's even surpassed that. Do you have concern that for that crossover voter or that undecided voter that sees the big money coming in from California or New York, the things that Tate alluded to last night, that might give them pause? And what would you say to those folks?
Well, I don't have as much concern about that as I think the Tate Reeves campaign, wants to elevate it to. And obviously he's got his surrogates out there talking about that issue because he's concerned about it. He's never had to worry about somebody having more money than him. So this is a new dilemma for him to have. And this is the way he's decided to confront it by going after the geographical location of Brandon Presley's campaign contributors. But ironically, I was asked about 6 months ago, how a Democrat running for governor could fund a race, and would they have to seek money from outside the state? And I said, absolutely. And let me tell you why. Because when one party has complete and total control of a state, a supermajority in both chambers, they have the ability to appoint every single board chairman, board member, commissioner, and can award contracts to their contributors like Tate has done, then the other party has to look elsewhere because all the money gets sucked up by that party that's in charge. Of course, that's the GOP in Mississippi, and Tate's been in a position to suck all that money up for a decade or more. So that's the reality of the situation. But I think that's something that only the political insiders really give much thought to. So it may be real important in this sphere that you and I are in today, but I don't think it's very important to voters at all. And if they were considering that, I would tell them that, don't they agree it's time for change? And the only way you're going to get change is to have a candidate who's funded well enough so that they can do battle and make it about turnout. Because we only get to that point where it's about turnout if you have enough money to be competitive. And Brandon Presley has done a great job of raising the money necessary to be competitive.
One of the most expensive governor's races in Mississippi history, Brandon Presley's raised a lot of money. Tate already had a really good campaign chest. So it's, there's still going to be a lot of spending here just in the next few days leading up. And then, of course, the prospect of a runoff always being there in the background with another third candidate in there. If neither of the candidates gets to 50%, we could see a runoff. So this could continue for a few weeks. David, would you mind sticking around with us for another block? We're just coming up on a break here. Would you stick around with us for another segment?
For you, Ashley, absolutely.
Hey, thank you so much. This is David Baria, former Mississippi legislator, former Mississippi U.S. Senate candidate, and we'll be back on the backside of this break. You're listening to Middays on SuperTalk Mississippi. I'm Ashley Edwards, guest hosting for Gerard today, and we're joined by former Mississippi legislator and former U.S. Senate candidate David Baria. David's been here talking on behalf of the Brandon Presley campaign. We've been talking a little bit about the debate last night. David, one question I have for you, and I want you to translate a little bit for our listeners. I was just during the break pulling up Brandon Presley's Twitter or X page, and he says in his bio that he is a populist and an FDR/Billy McCoy Democrat. What does that mean to you? What should that mean to voters in Mississippi?
Well, this is, of course, just my interpretation, but I think what he's trying to say is that he's the type of Democrat that uses the agency of government to get big things done. And I know that Brandon likes to talk about things like the TVA that was, I believe, first instituted under President Roosevelt. And there were, of course, lots of other big works projects that were undertaken and some of which were completed under Roosevelt. Well, and likewise, when Billy was merely a member of the House and the chairman of transportation, he passed probably the largest transportation infrastructure bill that Mississippi has ever taken up or passed, the highway program, which, if you're driving anywhere around our state now and you're driving on a good road, then you can probably thank Billy McCoy and the other folks who he brought along to support that program. It cost a lot of money, but it's how we move commerce and we move people around our state. So I think what Brandon Presley is referring to is the ability of government through its resources to do big things that help everybody and in the process create jobs.
Along those lines, Brandon Presley in some of his plans, he's talked about increasing spending on things like Medicaid expansion, increasing spending on education. He's also talking about tax cuts. And so, his plan has some similarities to what we saw come through the House of Representatives a few years ago, really led by Speaker Gunn, which was cutting the grocery tax, for example. There are a lot of things there, but at the end of the day, what would you say to a Mississippian that says, how are we going to increase spending in all these various areas and then also cut revenues at the same time? Mississippi's in one of the best financial positions it's ever been in today. That certainly hasn't historically been the case, and you remember those years well. Do you think that's a sustainable plan?
Well, I absolutely do. If you actually dot your I's and cross your T's, everybody that I have talked to in the last 20 years has complained about the tax on groceries. There's really doesn't make any sense, and it is a regressive tax that hurts the poorest among us. And so I think everybody would be in favor of doing away with the grocery tax, but you have to offset that decrease in revenue from that tax with revenue from somewhere else. And while you talk about increased spending for Medicaid, that's a good deal for Mississippi because the match initially it was zero. So we just passed on $2 billion if we had expanded Medicaid at the original opportunity. 2 years, $2 billion, it cost us nothing. Now it's 10%. So if I'm going to invest $1 and get 10 back, that's a pretty good deal for me and my family and in my business, and it is for the state of Mississippi. People have to understand right now that Mississippi is the largest benefactor of federal government largesse in the entire country. So for every dollar we put up in taxes, we get $3 back from the federal government. So when Mississippi and Tate Reeves said, well, we don't want to expand Medicaid and take advantage of that dollar down for $9 back, the taxpayers in California and New York that he likes to talk about so much said, whew, thank God, our money's not going to Mississippi. It's really just a smart deal that I think your former boss, Governor Haley Barbour, would have said, well, I'm going to spend this in a way that helps me politically, but I'm not going to leave that money on the table. And that's what Tate Reeves and his predecessor, Governor Bryant, did as well. We've left billions of dollars on the table. There's no way that makes economic sense for a state like Mississippi. And it creates jobs if we would expand Medicaid. And perhaps the most important aspect of all of this that we shouldn't forget is it provides insurance coverage for 230,000 of Mississippi's working poor citizens.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned Governor Barber. He was really the last governor in Mississippi that had to work with a split legislature. Billy McCoy, obviously Speaker of the House, and so you had Democrat control and a Republican governor. We remember back to the days of Kirk Fordyce and him having to work with the Democrat legislature and just the vitriol that occurred there. Governor Barber, who I believe was one of the best governors, the best governor in Mississippi history, really had a knack for being able to work across the aisle and get things done with people that weren't in his party. We've come a long way since then, and we have a much more polarized country, a more polarized state than we did in those days. Let's hypothetically say that Brandon Presley's elected. We know that there are certainly things that the legislature is going to have to go along with that he's saying he's going to get done. You've got a lot of experience working in the legislature. You know as well as anybody that even when one party controls it, they don't always work together well. Do you think Brandon Presley would have the ability to work across the aisle with a Republican House and Senate and actually get these pieces of his plan implemented?
Yes, and you don't have to look any further than what Brandon was able to do with broadband expansion in Mississippi. I mean, here's a guy who decided that this is something that is needed in communities like where he's from, up in Northeast Mississippi. And this also goes back to what he says about being a Billy McCoy and Roosevelt Democrat. But he saw a need for every child, every family in Mississippi to have access to the internet through expansion of broadband. And he worked that thing like a rented mule. And he got it done with a Republican governor and a supermajority Republican legislature. And you once told me, Ashley, that you worked for a governor who decided first what is the best policy. And then he figured out how to work the politics to make it a reality. That's the kind of governor that Brandon Presley would be. And Tate Reeves is not that guy. He's just not. He's going to decide what's best politics for him first, and then everything else comes second to that.
For those that don't know Brandon Presley as well as you do, they've seen him obviously as a candidate. They've seen political ads. They saw him last night in the debate. But what kind of a person is he? What kind of a man is he?
Well, Brandon Presley is what you see is what you get guy. I mean, when he talks about his story growing up in the house that, you could see the ground through the floorboards, and his mama had to make hard decisions about whether to put food on the table or pay bills, and his father being an alcoholic who was murdered when he was a young child. That's all true, and that all goes into who he is as a human being. He has an uncle who was formerly the sheriff of Lee County, I believe it was Lee County, and he was killed in the line of duty. He has a law enforcement background in his family, and he is a non-drinker himself because of his, what happened with his father. This is a person who eats, drinks, and sleeps Mississippi, and particularly what's good for all Mississippians, not just wealthy Mississippians, but everybody, because he knows what it's like to grow up poor and to be without, and he knows what it's going to take to lift all boats in Mississippi. That's just the kind of man he is. And if Brandon Presley tells you something, you can take it to the bank. Like last night when he said, I don't care who gives me a contribution, they're not going to change who I am. They're not going to change what I believe is right. And he means that because it's true. That's who he is.
David, I appreciate you joining us. We've got just about a minute left here. In the last few seconds we have, do you want to make any bold predictions for next Tuesday?
Well, the boldest prediction that I'm going to make is it's going to be razor thin. It's going to be a very, very close election. And if the Presley campaign can do what they know needs to be done in terms of getting the turnout, out on election day, then he'll win. In the Democratic Party, we have a saying: it's if we vote, we win. And we just tend to not vote in any years but the presidential election years. So we've got to turn up that turnout machine, and we have to have help from the kinds of people that I talk to every day down here on the Gulf Coast who are Republicans who tell me, David, I wouldn't tell anybody this, but when I go to the polls on November 7th, I'm voting Brandon Presley. And there are a lot of those people out there, Ashley, and I don't know if there are enough, but it's going to be very close. But I think Brandon Presley is going to win it in a tight one.
Certainly seems like we got a close race, and it's going to be interesting to watch. This has been David Baria. David, thank you so much for joining us. It was really a pleasure to talk with you here today, and we'll be watching next Tuesday to see what happens. David Baria, again, former Mississippi legislator, former U.S. Senate candidate for Mississippi. We're about to head into a break here. You're listening to Middays on SuperTalk Mississippi. Stick with us through this break. And when we come back, we're going to close out the show going into the 1 o'clock hour.